Hello, and welcome to this IFSEA podcast on the Glass Cliff. My name's Emma Sangeelee, and I'm a partner at specialist employment partnership and regulatory firm CM Murray. This podcast follows an in-person event we held a couple of months ago at Mishcon de Reya's offices, and it was really well received. And so we thought we would regroup and record this podcast for anyone interested in the topic and who wasn't able to attend that event. I'm going to chair the discussion and I'll kick off with just a brief overview, a brief intro to what the concept is. So the glass cliff is it's a term that's quite new to me, and I think it might be for a lot of people. What we'll all be familiar with are the individual types of discrimination that contribute to glass cliff scenarios. But to recognise a glass cliff scenario, you sort of have to take a step back and see the bigger picture. Because what it speaks to is a pattern that we see play out across industries, across different businesses, that impacts underrepresented leaders. And what we mean by underrepresented is really anyone who isn't both white and male. And what the research shows is that for underrepresented leaders, they are disproportionately appointed into a leadership role during a time of crisis. So where there's already been a downturn in performance, then they are often not supported sufficiently for success by their teams or by their organisations, often unconsciously. And then they are attributed blame for those failures often in place before even their appointment. That blame being attributed to them individually, but also specifically to their gender and or race. And then to sort of complete the circle, often they're removed from role and replaced by a white man. So it's important, obviously it's important to the individual. It can be catastrophic in terms of their reputation, their careers, their mental well-being, leadership confidence. But it's also important because if it plays out to its natural conclusion, what happens is it compounds the biases which underpin the discrimination we see every day. So what we're hoping to do today is give some information about what it is so we can recognise it, and then have a bit of a discussion about what we can do as advisors to try and interrupt glass cliff scenarios from playing out to their natural conclusion. And we've got a great panel to have that discussion. I'll let them introduce themselves, but Sophie, if we could start with you.
Hello, and thank you so much for giving that sort of introduction to the glass cliff as a phenomenon in itself. So my name is Sophie Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the author of the book, The Glass Cliff. And so the glass cliff isn't based on my original research. The glass cliff isn't a phenomenon that I discovered or that I named. It's something that I came across while I was doing research for a different book and found it so interesting that I realised I have to write the book about this. Just to give you a bit of my professional background, I'm an ex-Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer in advertising. I'm an ex-global leader at Netflix. And yeah, for the past few years, learning about, talking about, helping other people to understand the glass cliff as a phenomenon that they have seen play out, even if they haven't consciously recognised it at the time, is sort of what my main time and energy has been spent on recently.
Kevin?
Thanks, Emma, and thank you for the invitation to join the podcast. It was a great discussion that we had a couple of months or so ago. So it's great to have the opportunity to reprise that and get it to a wider audience because it's such an important and interesting topic. So I'm a partner at a consulting firm called PSFI. We work predominantly with financial services and other professional services firms on various leadership issues. So I work largely with boards and executive teams on addressing some of these issues that we're talking about today. And before I started my consulting career a few years ago, I had a long career as an HR professional, again, predominantly in financial services and professional services, where again I was advising the board and the executive committee as an internal advisor in that role as chief people officer. My last role before stepping away from my executive career was as UK Chief People Officer for KPMG.
Last but not least, Jennifer?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks so much for having me. I am a partner at Mishcon de Reya, a law firm predominantly based in London, and I have spent the last 20 years advising employers and senior executives on all manner of employment issues, including quite a focus on discrimination.
Great. Well, let's kick off then. Sophie, can you give us an outline, first of all, of just what is the glass cliff? You know, how and why does it show up in the modern workplace, and how can we recognise it when it does?
I think one of the interesting things to understand about the glass cliff is sort of how it was first. I don't know if discovered is the right word for it, but how the term was coined and how that sort of all played out. So back in 2005, the Times newspaper ran an article on the front page of their business section with the headline, "Women on the Board, a help or a hindrance?" And it talked about women's stepping into leadership roles, and they decided that women on the board were in fact hindrance. And they decided that because they said that after businesses appointed women to those most senior roles, whether that is a position on the board, whether that's sort of the chief leadership position, that those businesses seem to find themselves in a moment of trouble. And so they decided that women on the board were in fact business. And a couple of researchers from the University of Exeter saw this and they thought, that's really strange. And if that's true, that's really worth looking into and, you know, knowing more about. And so they did look into it. What they found was that those businesses that appointed women to those leadership positions for the first time were disproportionately already experiencing a moment of operational crisis, a moment of difficulty. And that could demonstrate in all sorts of ways. That could be a hit to market valuation, that could be a hit to stock, that could be a reputational scandal. It could be all sorts of different things. It could play out in different ways. But those businesses, on average, were already in a period of 3 or more months of poor performance or crisis before that underrepresented leader was appointed to that leadership position. And so what we really found was, instead of women being bad for business, as that article in that headline might have made people think and feel, that bad business was actually causing women to be appointed rather than women being appointed causing poor business outcomes. And so that is really interesting, and it makes a lot of sense when we think about how the makeup, where the sort of demographic distribution of different groups within businesses disproportionately sits. So we can see, we all know that men are disproportionately represented in those most senior leadership positions. When we think about the businesses that we've worked in, the businesses that we've observed, when we think about the books that we read and who were depicted doing what sort of roles when we were children, we know that, you know, if I like to use the example of Richard Scarry because I really like his little busy town characters. But I looked at those books again recently. All of the women are sort of in homemaking or sort of some kind of domestic caregiving roles. And, you know, the men are the people who are out there in the town, you know, making things happen and driving the big trucks that are so fun in all the pictures. But when we talk about women and underrepresented people taking on leadership positions, that idea of them being underrepresented is really important to this discussion. So I'm just going to read some stats very quickly about that sort of demographic makeup at different levels of the business. And so in the book I write, women of colour, which isn't a phrase that I like, but I have to sort of use the terms that the researchers who have done the work have used. So women of colour represent 19% of the workforce when you look at the entry level. And by the time we get to the C-suite, that figure has shrunk to just 5%. White women represent 29% at entry level, and that has shrunk slightly to 21% by C-suite. Men of colour start at about 19% representation at those entry level roles, and that shrinks to 13% by the time we reach the C-suite. And white men begin at about 33% representation in those early entry-level roles, and they reach the C-suite with about 61% representation. They are the only demographic group of all of them that has a representational growth as they make it, you sort of up that career ladder. And so when we say that we're talking about underrepresented leaders, we're talking really about anyone who doesn't hold the dual identities of whiteness and maleness, because that single identity is really overrepresented. So that's what we mean, at least in this conversation, when we're talking about people who are underrepresented. And we often talk about the glass cliff as something that primarily faces or primarily challenges women in their careers, and that's true. But we also need to remember that racially marginalised men face a lot of the same challenges that we're going to be discussing as we go through today.
I think that data is so stark. I mean, this is what your book's so brilliant at doing, is because we all know that instinctively to be true. When you see those figures, it really sort of brings it home.
We all know it's true, and we know it's true to the degree that there is a phenomenon called think manager, think male. We have these internalized images, and it's not necessarily our fault. It's not because we've done something wrong. It's because that is the sort of socialization of the world of work that we have inherited. And whilst that might be changing slowly, in those changes we see these challenges start to emerge, like the glass cliff. And so the think manager, think male phenomenon tends to hold true until we reach a moment of crisis. And when we reach a moment of crisis, that mindset seems to be replaced by think crisis, think female. And that could be for all sorts of reasons. It could be that women are seen as more disposable within businesses. It could be that women are seen as a higher risk in a leadership position in businesses. It could be that we expect women to have better soft skills. So for businesses being through a moment of crisis, it's likely that you're going to have an employee base who are feeling potentially disengaged or who are feeling worried, and having someone who fills the sort of more idealized maternal role might be seen to be good in that way. But we can see that think crisis, think female is a real foundational element of why we end up in glass cliff scenarios, because we think that women are really good for coming in and cleaning up messes and for making people feel better. But if we don't believe that they have, or we don't necessarily hire them in order to have that transformational business regeneration skill set, even though they do have it, then we don't set them up for success, and we often end up creating these glass cliff scenarios.
So Kevin, from your perspective, sort of going sort of internally, looking at how these sort of crisis appointments are made and the sort of board dynamics, what is it about that you think that means that these sort of glass cliff appointments are made, perhaps unconsciously or consciously?
Well, I think some of it is really the result of poor succession planning and poor leadership development, in that if organizations haven't really been attending to issues around succession and the development of that next generation of leaders, when they hit a crisis and there's a need to change the leader, it's too late. Then they've days in which to complete a process that really ought to take much longer in making an assessment of potential candidates and then providing them with the developmental support that they need to position them for success in the future. And so if many organizations have to say, don't really attend to succession planning and leadership development sufficiently, and therefore it's inevitable that when they come to the point of deciding who they're going to appoint, that leader is probably going to be ill-equipped. And given what Sophie's been saying around the propensity to appoint women in those situations, what we're doing is we're setting those women up to fail, because they've not been developed, they've not been given the support that they need as they emerge as potential leadership candidates. Now, it's true of some men who are appointed as well. To be frank, there are men who are appointed who have not had the benefit of the necessary support and development that again would really set them up for success. But I think it's particularly critical when you're talking about those groups who, again, as Sophie's just been saying, are progressing through the organisation at a disproportionate rate. Because there are more men as they become more senior, they tend to take the lion's share of the development opportunities that are available. And of course, when I talk about leadership development, a lot of people will have in their mind sending somebody off to a business school for a week-long program, or an internal program or something like that, where actually most of the real development comes from the experiences that people have. So giving them access to leading internal projects, or leading a new initiative for expansion into a new product area or a new geography. Or having access to different clients. So those opportunities often disproportionately go to the men, and women and racially minoritized leaders don't have the same access to those. So what will happen is that when you get to that point of appointing somebody, everybody's ill-prepared, often is the case, but the underrepresented leaders are even more poorly prepared than their white male colleagues.
You've got some interesting data on that, haven't you, Sophie, in your book around, is it the broken rung in terms of progression opportunities, and then also the impact of being the only woman or the only person of whatever race it is that's then the different pressures that they're under. Can you speak a bit to that data? I think it goes directly to what Kevin was just talking about.
And this is the same as when we did our panel in person. There's, whenever Kevin's speaking, and I'm like, yes, this is all correct, and this is all like so in line with everything that I have been sort of working on and speaking about for the past few years. So I'm always pleased to hear him talk about these things. And the first thing that I will say that about that training for leadership, not necessarily coming from an academic formalized training opportunity, is completely true and correct. And that is what we generally refer to as glamour work. So men traditionally, disproportionately in businesses, have higher access to what's known as glamour work. And glamour work is work that puts you into a new business area, or work that is directly revenue driving, or work that puts you into close proximity to senior leadership within that business. And that really helps to establish stronger connections, stronger access to opportunities, and stronger access to sponsorship. And we see that women are disproportionately overrepresented in mentoring spaces, both as mentors and mentees. But we see that men are really overrepresented in sponsorship. And we see that sponsorship is actually what seems to make a real difference in terms of progression and opportunity compared to mentorship. And as well as being sort of sidelined away from this mentorship, we see women getting burdened with what is commonly thought of as the opposite of glamour work, which is office housework. And that's like the literal housework of keeping an office running, or it could be ERGs, it could be, planning social events, it could be all of these things that disproportionately do seem to fall to women because, again, of this expectation of soft skills and maternal instincts and mothering, rather than understanding the value of their potential work. But to follow up on what you were saying about things like the broken rung, the broken rung really looks at how we progress once we get into those very first areas of our career, those very first levels of business. And what we see is that for every 87 women who are promoted in that very first layer, 100 men are promoted. So we have a shortfall of women in those promotional spaces. The good thing about having written a book about it is I don't have to keep all the stats in my head. I can just read you a bit. I'm going to let me tell you about the broken rung. So this section uses US-based research because the US does a better job of collecting intersectional demographic data than it's easy to do in many European countries. And so sometimes we need to default to that data. They've written that despite women in the US making up 57% of college level graduates, so the majority of college level graduates, fewer women than men are hired into entry level roles. The next stage of that journey is a first promotion, and the story there is no better. In fact, for every 100 men promoted from entry level to that first management position, only 87 women are promoted and only 82 women of colour. And this reinforces existing gender disparity that was created in that initial hiring. And it means that from the very first step into most junior levels of management, men already significantly outnumber women. And the research has shown that if women were promoted at the same rate as men at the same level, the number of women in senior positions of SVP and C-suite roles would almost double. This is a problem that only becomes more heightened when promotions are made from those mid to more senior levels of management and those leadership roles. Because men are already overrepresented at those lower management tiers, there are simply more of them to choose from when making ongoing upward promotions. And so, of course, men are more likely to be selected to take the next steps of advancement up the career ladders, creating and reinforcing a gap that goes some way to explaining why, when we look at C-level roles in corporate America, men represent 74% of the people holding those roles and women only 26%. So we talk a lot about this pipeline. We talk a lot about, we've heard the excuse and justification for so long that there just aren't the good women out there to choose from for these roles. And we know that that's not true, but we also know that these broken rungs on the career ladder, from that first step out of education and those first steps into more senior roles, we have those gaps that women are not being promoted into equally. And so, although I don't have very little time for the idea that there aren't the good women in the pipeline to pick from, we're not doing anything with the broken rung to help to correct that, to help to balance that.
And so the idea is that if you have an organisation that addresses that sort of progression issue, and Jen will speak about this as well, that this is the type of sex discrimination that we are all familiar with in terms of how opportunities are distributed amongst genders. But if you have an organisation that does grapple with that better, is it right that then you're less likely to see a glass cliff scenario playing out because they are better supported in position?
Partially because of better support and partially because of less of an idea of novelty. So at the moment, when we bring the person who is deeply underrepresented into a leadership role, there is an idea either consciously or subconsciously of risk, and an idea either subconsciously or consciously of novelty. And there's a halo effect that comes with that because it's so... there are so few prominent female leaders of big, successful enterprise level businesses that often their appointment is met with a lot of fanfare or a lot of media attention. We saw that when someone like Linda Yaccarino takes over from Elon Musk as the CEO of Twitter. And we also saw how that played out in the end. We see so few women taking on or being given the opportunity to take on these roles that they become sort of attractions. They become sort of figures and discussion within the media, and so they're facing so much more scrutiny, and it becomes so much harder to get buy-in internally. And I think that's really important to understand about the glass cliff, because you need to be the first or one of the first in your organization as a woman to be appointed to that position to have a high chance of facing the glass cliff. If women in these very senior leadership positions are normal place, if it's a female founded business, if it's always been led by women, you're not likely to face the glass cliff, because this idea of novelty, this idea of risk, this idea of doing something different is important in the context of that environment.
Emma, can I just chip in? I think it's something that Sophie said very briefly that I think might just be worth spending a few minutes on. Sophie mentioned mentorship and sponsorship, and I think that distinction is so important because the sponsorship is what gets people promoted, and I don't think that everybody really understands the distinction between the two. And also the fact that even if they do understand the distinction, and we can talk about what that distinction is in a moment, they don't do enough to address the unequal access to sponsorship. And so again, the majority white male group have easy access to other sponsors who look like them, because we've just talked about the fact that there's a disproportionate number of other white men in senior roles, and they tend to form those sponsorship relationships organically, whereas it's much more difficult for women and racially minoritized leaders to create those sponsorship relationships. And so organizations really need to systemically intervene to create those sponsorship opportunities, because it's those sponsorship relationships that get people promoted. And why is that? Well, that's because mentoring is actually quite a passive relationship, whereas sponsorship is a very active relationship. You are advocating on behalf of the person that you are sponsoring. And that looks like advocacy for them when they're not in the room. So who is speaking for you when there's a group of people around saying, who's in the promotion pipeline this year? Well, Emma's in the promotion pipeline. Yeah, I've got a few doubts about Emma, and somebody says, well, hang on a moment. Your sponsor steps in and says, just tell me what those doubts are, and they really, really advocate on behalf of their sponsee. They also are the person who clears the barriers out of the way. I love that phrase that Sophie used around glamour work. It's not a phrase I'm going to pinch that, unashamedly pinch that as a description of the type of work you need access to progress within an organization. The sponsors are the ones who clear the barriers out of the way, so you get access to that glamour work. And again, it's much easier for men to clear those barriers out of the way because they're disproportionately represented in those senior roles that have the power and the authority to get the barriers removed and give access. So I really think that this distinction about mentoring and sponsorship is really a pretty important one when you're thinking about what can organizations do to intervene to reduce the prospect of there being a last cliff appointment.
That's so interesting. Obviously when you're asserting discrimination, it's, acts or omissions. And it's really interesting to look at, who is sponsored and who is being supported. It's not all about overt acts of discrimination. But Jen, if I can bring you in on that then, I mean, obviously this has been a whistle-stop tour of what the glass cliff is. But in your view, what is the sort of legal significance of this in terms of advising senior execs to start off with? How do you think this is sort of relevant?
Yeah, I think it's hugely significant. And actually, I came from a position when I was first looking at this concept of some skepticism, I have to say, of it being a real thing that we could use in litigation, for example, acting for senior executives on the one hand, pursuing claims of less favourable treatment on grounds of sex or on grounds of race. And equally, a slight degree of skepticism of whether there was anything really that the employer could do about this, even if it was a thing, right? And Sophie's brilliant articulation of actually what it is and the statistics that support it mean that it's actually an incredibly powerful concept for us as practitioners to be using, whether prosecuting or defending discrimination claims. And if we pause for a second and work out how all this plays into discrimination, it sounds obvious, but it's not necessarily that obvious, and it's even less obvious to try and find evidence of it. So discrimination is that less favourable treatment in broad terms on grounds of a protected characteristic. But it is incredibly difficult evidentially to establish that discrimination has occurred. But the more tools we have in our armoury as advisors of senior executives to point to it being a real thing, and the closest analogy I can think of in terms of something that's similarly used very frequently by practitioners to great effect, and rightly so, is the concept of unconscious bias. So you can't point to the piece of evidence, the smoking gun that says this shows that there's bias there, that there's discrimination there. But where the research has been done and the commentary has been produced, and the analysis has been disseminated around the fact that it happens in practice, you can then persuade an employment tribunal that is what your client has been the victim of. So it's incredibly powerful, and I think the glass cliff is exactly the same, where we can say, look at this pattern of behaviour. look at what has happened. Look at the story, the journey that this woman has been on. This this individual has been on. What is the reasonable or the other explanation for it? And let's bring in the what we say is the discriminatory narrative, and using the statistics that are in Sophie's book are incredibly powerful for that, I think.
Yes, because it's about comparison, isn't it? And that's where the stats, I think, become so helpful, because they demonstrate that difference in treatment without us having to. It lowers the hurdle a little, isn't it?
Yeah, it talks about a societal concept, this concept of discrimination, rather than you having to identify an individual who has gone out of their way within an organisation to marginalise or treat that individual less favourably. And it also plays in, I think, to that the element of unconscious or subconscious that we talked about earlier. That often it's the way, as we've heard from Kevin and from Sophie, it's the way sometimes that the organisational structures and societal structures will hold women back in the way that we've seen. And if we can use those to say, this is why this individual has found themselves in the position that no white man would find themselves in. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, it enables us to have a conversation that's less adversarial as well. If we're engaged early enough to try and prevent the individual actually being pushed off the glass cliff. And I wonder if we can talk a bit about what individuals can do. I don't know, Sophie, are there sort of key signifiers, when someone's offered a role that they should be looking out for to think, this might put me in a vulnerable position? Should we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that Jennifer said really reminded me of the question that we got at the end of the panel that we did in person. And one of the questions was, but why wouldn't people want their businesses to be successful? Why would you hire someone in order to make them unsuccessful? And I think I was really glad that someone asked that, because I'm so engaged and ingrained in the work that it's not obvious to me always what's not obvious to other people. And what's not obvious to other people is that, as you've been saying, a lot of this is like unconscious bias. It's subconscious. We're not saying we want the business to fail. We're not saying we want this woman to do badly. We're not consciously saying any of those things, but we haven't necessarily taken the time, the effort, the insight, asked the questions, been curious enough, gathered the data to find out, well, what do people who aren't just this one demographic group, what do more people need in order to be successful? What do more people need that we need to make sure that we're offering? Because workplaces as we know them were largely set up by a single group of people with a single group of people in mind. And what's it like when you don't fit that ideal, when you don't fit that default? I think is where we see things like the glass cliff and those sorts of other potentially subconscious areas of discrimination demonstrating themselves. But in terms of risk factors, in terms of things to be aware of, if you are considering a role or if you are in a hiring position, sort of whatever side of that conversation, of that table you're on. So are things like, is the business in a moment of crisis? Have they had a reputational issue? Can you see that their stock valuation has failed? Have they had some sort of thing that you can research? And you can't always research, you can't always see or be aware of these internal machinations externally, but that's one thing to be aware of. Is there a moment of crisis? Another thing to be aware of is, have women already been successfully represented in leadership positions within this business? If it is a business that has only had a single group of people in this type of role up to now, then there's a reason potentially that they are suddenly making a change from that group who they consider to be tried and tested and established to someone who's outside of it. And it could be that you are exceptional, and lots of people are exceptional. And I think it's really important to note that not every appointment of a woman to a senior role is going to be a glass cliff scenario. Sometimes women get great jobs because they are the right person for that job and they are treated well and respected within that business. I don't want anyone who is a woman or an underrepresented leader in any other way to think, well, I can't do this because it's just going to lead to the glass cliff. Because it's not necessarily, we have to have these sort of factors in place. So a moment of crisis, underrepresented leaders like you up to now, there has to be, to a degree, a lack of internal support. And this is almost impossible to find out before you accept a role. You can try to network with people, you can try to talk to people, you can try to establish who your closest connections within the business would be if you were to take that role. But for the glass cliff to play out, once you're in role, there needs to be a lack of internal support around you. And there is generally, but not always, an expectation of soft skills, an expectation that you will be able to clean up the mess and make people feel better. And so you might be offered a senior leadership role and you can say, there's been no crisis and there have been 5 women who have successfully and happily held this role ahead of me. Then your chances of facing the glass cliff, your chances of finding yourself at the edge of a professional precipice are much less likely. But if you do find that there is a moment of crisis, there haven't been leaders like you before, you can somehow determine that there's a lack of internal support and your interview is talking more about your soft skills and your business transformational skills, then there's a strong chance that you're going to find yourself at the edge of a glass cliff.
I think there's a number of things you can then do if you're in that situation, Sophie, to try and protect yourself. You can look at the contractual protections you have when you're negotiating your way into these positions. If you have some of those alarm bells are ringing, like you're saying, ensuring that you've got a real clear scope of authority, of reporting lines, decision-making power, so that you are actually in control rather than being a sort of potentially a scapegoat, including clear role descriptions and objectives. And then ensuring that from the, if things go wrong, that you've got a good long notice period, that your sign-on bonuses, your deferred compensation, those sorts of things at senior levels are not give you the financial cushion at the very least that you're going to need if the worst happens and you find yourself at the precipice of that glass cliff. So you have options, you have some financial security. And thinking also about due diligence on the way in, so more sort of interrogating the state of the business, finding out what the real state of the books is, the real crises, the real issues internally, and whether they're going to be something you're going to be able to fix, and whether it's something that you are being asked to fix but being sort of consciously or otherwise set up to fail on. And I think if there's a reluctance to share that information within the reasonable sort of confines of confidentiality, then I think that's a further red flag for that individual as they're discussing what is going to be expected of them. And so there's a lot of that you can think about on the way in. There's obviously a huge number of things that if you're facing that precipice and looking at exiting that can be done to try and secure your position, but you're so much stronger if you have anticipated these things on the way in, I think.
I think the other thing I would add as a kind of practical piece of advice is particularly for external appointments is to think about who's interviewing you. They are invested in your success because they've been part of the decision to appoint you. And thinking amongst that group as to who you want to be your sponsor, and it can be one person or it could be a number of people, but there's something about that group being a part of the selection panel that's making the decision. As I say, they're investing some of their personal capital in making the decision. People know that they were on the appointment committee, and therefore, if your appointment is not successful, then actually it reflects to some extent on them for having made that decision. So they're invested in your success. So really leverage those relationships and think about how they can support you as you step into the role. Think also about who isn't. They're not inviting to interview, and whether there's other people you would like to ask to be a part of that process, people who you would like to enroll in that appointment process, because it may be, let's say the CFO isn't a part of the appointment panel. They're probably a pretty important relationship that you're going to have. Any leader in an organisation has got to have a great relationship with the CFO. So if they're not part of the selection panel, say you want to meet them. You don't need to be a passive participant in this process. You can influence what that process looks like. I think too many candidates, sort of feel a bit passive in this, and that to tell these are the people they're meeting, and et cetera, et cetera. But you can say, well, I haven't yet met the CFO. I'd like to meet them. I haven't yet met the chief commercial officer. I would like to meet them before I make my decision. So just some tactical stuff I think that you can do, as well as the really practical advice that Jennifer's just given you around how you get yourself set up just in case things do go wrong.
And of course, it's an ongoing discussion, really. Once you're in post, as you say, you can't know all the challenges you're going to face at entry point. And I think it's about having the confidence to say what you need to succeed. And particularly when you're observing that perhaps you're not getting the support that you need, it can be really difficult for lots of reasons, and we won't have time to go into them all, but a lot of them are explored in Sophie's books. Issues about being the only person at that level. It's hard to you don't want to accept that you're perhaps being discriminated against, even unconsciously, and so there's a temptation to let these things play out. But just quickly, I don't know if anyone's got any comments as the conversation goes on, the sorts of things people should be looking for or raising to get the sort of types of support that they need.
Well, I was thinking there's something, Emma, around being very clear about what the success criteria actually are. And I think Jennifer mentioned that. On the way in, how am I going to be measured? What does success look like? And then making sure that you're getting regular feedback on that. And actually, my experience is that organisations get worse about giving feedback the more senior people become. They kind of just expect them somehow to know how they're doing, and senior leaders avoid some of those more challenging conversations if there is some difficult feedback to be provided. So, again, don't assume that you're because you're not hearing anything that everything's going well, because my experience is that actually they often don't say anything until the point comes when you're brought into a room and they say, I'm really sorry, things aren't really going well, and we want to start having a conversation around the consequences of that. So go and seek that feedback, and it's not just kind of from your direct reporting line, but go seek it from peers, so that you can check if there are any early signs that you need to kind of course correct in the way that you're doing the role. Again, it's about being active rather than passive. You can sit there and wait until somebody comes and gives you the feedback. Don't go out there and find it, and then you can act on that feedback as you get it.
I think a really interesting point of data in Sophie's book is around how when you have an underrepresented leader, often people who don't identify either with their race or gender can become less engaged in the business. That was quite a surprise to me. So it seems that's something that individuals and organisations really need to anticipate. We're running out of time, but I do want Jen to touch on the change to the unfair dismissal regime, because culturally, in terms of how senior individuals are managed, because you're right, Kevin, performance isn't very well managed and people are just sort of managed out because of the cap on unfair dismissal. Jen, can you speak a bit about that and how it may be relevant to reasonableness and how Glasscliff scenarios are managed reasonably?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting for us as practitioners, but also those whom we advise. At the moment, the position is that if you are putting a claim for unfair dismissal in the employment tribunal, your damages are capped at a low amount compared to the salaries and the remuneration compensation of those who we're talking about here. When the cap comes off the damages you can claim for unfair dismissal, then you put an unfair dismissal claim more or less on a par with a discrimination claim in terms of the damages that could be claimed. Discrimination claims have had uncapped damages for as long as we can remember. So the discrimination claim currently is very valuable. And when we're advising individuals who are facing these sorts of scenarios, it is important for us to be trying to establish the differential in treatment, discriminatory treatment that we've been discussing. But when the cap comes off the damages from unfair dismissal, then actually an individual can speak to an unfairness in their treatment, a failure of to have a substantive reason for a dismissal, or a failure of procedure even in relation to the process of them being pushed off that glass cliff and the reasons for it. And that becomes an incredibly powerful weapon for an individual facing a scenario such as this. And it could change the landscape entirely, I think, for these sorts of claims. And the battleground is going to be more around what would have happened if an employer followed a fair process, what would have happened if the employer had done things properly, because pretty often at those senior levels there is a lack at the moment of process and fairness, on the basis that unless you can establish a successful discrimination claim, the liability for the employer is relatively limited. So I think it changes the way we will advise quite significantly.
Yeah, and I think again it's another argument for sort of early intervention, because it's going to be difficult to argue unfairness if you haven't been asking the right questions, asking for support, identifying the issues. But if you have been engaged and you can demonstrate that your employer has unreasonably not provided that support, it really changes the landscape. So it's definitely an interesting, well, for lots of reasons in employment law, this is a huge shift, but it's definitely interesting in this context.
Yeah, not having to establish that you have been treated less favourably than a comparator, rather that your treatment is unfair, is a huge change.
So listen, thank you everyone. That's been great to run over. Obviously been really high level. If you are interested in this topic and want to know more about it, I cannot recommend Sophie's book enough. We'll pop the information on our website with this podcast. But it's so great. It's got all the data. It's really detailed. But then each chapter very helpfully has a summary. So, you can go back to it, and yeah, it's fabulous. And if you've got any other questions for anyone, all our details will be with this podcast, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.